My name is Vren, and for 11 years I ran the seed vault on Kestrel's Reach, a mining and trade platform wedged into the asteroid debris of a dead system nobody important cared about. If you want to picture it, imagine a rusted metal wheel spinning slowly around a chunk of rock, filled with tunnels, hydroponics bays that never quite worked right, and about 6,000 souls who all showed up here because somewhere else had already said no to them. We didn't grow much on Kestrel's Reach. The soil substrate was garbage, the light cycles were unreliable, and most of what passed for agriculture was really just very expensive hydroponic guesswork. So when a seed and spore exchange came through, traders bringing viable genetic stock from a dozen worlds to sell to desperate colonies like ours, it was a big deal. People lined up, deals got made, reputations got built or broken in a single afternoon. That's the world I want you to picture, because it matters for what happened next. We had a caste system here, unofficial but iron solid, same as every trade hub in the outer reach. The Kryvex ran security, 8-limbed things with exoskeletons like riot armor, permanently irritable, permanently in charge of who got through which door. Below them, the Ordu Combine handled the actual trading, slick operators who controlled licensing, tariffs, and every dispute that came up in the market ring. And below everyone, filed somewhere between livestock and acceptable nuisance, were what the Combine called fringe species. Small, low-tech, recently contacted worlds that hadn't yet proven themselves worth respecting. Humans were on that list. I'd worked with a couple of human traders before. Quiet people mostly. Polite, a little too direct for local taste. Prone to asking questions everyone else considered rude, like, why does this cost 3 times what it did last cycle? Or who actually approved this contract? Nobody thought much of them. Small, soft-skinned, no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. The kind of species you'd expect to fold the second someone raised a voice at them. So when Elena Voss stepped off her transport with a single reinforced case strapped to her back and asked, politely, for directions to the trial gate, nobody in that market ring expected the next 6 hours to end the way they did. I should explain the trial gate, because it's the whole reason this story happened at all, and it's the kind of local custom that sounds almost reasonable until you actually watch it in practice. Kestrel's Reach had a rule. Technically, a market entry fee, though everyone called it the trial gate, that any independent trader without existing Combine sponsorship had to prove their goods were worth the station's time before they'd be allowed a stall. In theory, this meant a quality inspection. In practice, it meant Bregoth Kalu, the Combine's floor enforcer, decided whether he liked you, and if he didn't, he'd invent a reason to humiliate you in front of the whole market until you either paid an expedited processing fee or gave up and left. Bregoth was a Vashtu, heavy-set, four-armed, built like a demolition unit, with a laugh that sounded like gravel being poured down a chute. He liked an audience. He especially liked an audience when the trader in question was small. Well, Bregoth said, planting 2 of his 4 hands on his hips as Elena approached the gate. What do we have here? Someone's mascot wander off its leash? The crowd, dockhands, buyers, a few Kryvex guards leaning against the wall pretending not to care, laughed. I laughed too, God help me. I want to be honest about that part, the same way I've heard other people be honest about their own worst days, because this story doesn't mean anything if I pretend I was better than I actually was. Elena didn't flinch. She set her case down carefully, like it mattered more than her own safety, which, I'd learn later, it absolutely did. I have a botanical exchange registered under Permit 4 Delta, she said. Viable spore cultures, tested and certified. I'd like to set up a stall. Permit doesn't mean anything without a trial pass, sweetheart, Bregoth said, leaning down so his breath, sour, metallic, the smell of a species that ate mostly raw ore fungus, washed over her. And the trial pass costs 300 credits. Or, he grinned, showing 4 rows of blunt grinding teeth. You could just open that case for me right now and let me decide if it's worth my time for free. Real generous offer, that. I don't have 300 credits, Elena said. Her voice was even, careful, the voice of someone budgeting every word like it cost something. I have the permit and the case. That's the deal I was told applies. Deals change, Brigoth said, and reached for the case. She stepped between him and it. Not aggressively, just placed herself there, the way you'd stand between a toddler and a hot stove, an act that seemed to genuinely confuse him for a second. "This case doesn't open outside of climate control," she said. "The cultures inside are alive. If the seal breaks in open atmosphere, they die in under 4 minutes, and 4 years of work dies with them. I'm not going to let that happen because you want to laugh." Brigoth's grin didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. I recognized it even then, though I didn't understand it. The particular flicker of a bully who has just been told no by someone who isn't backing down and hasn't yet decided how he feels about it. "Cute," he said. "You're going to lecture me about my own dock." He grabbed 2 dock hands standing nearby, big Ordu enforcers named Trask and Vol, the kind of muscle every market ring keeps on hand for exactly this purpose. "Get her case, gently. She's clearly too delicate to carry it herself." What happened next, I've replayed in my head more times than I can count, and I still don't think I fully understand how she did it, even now. Trask reached for the case. Elena moved, not fast in the sense of a blur, but fast in the sense of already knowing exactly where his hand would be before it got there, and redirected his grip with a small twist of her wrist that put him face first into the deck plating. It looked almost gentle. It was not gentle. I heard the crunch of his tusk cracking against a metal from 15 feet away. Vol didn't hesitate the way Trask had. He came in swinging, a full overhead strike that would have caved in a human skull like a soft fruit if it had landed. It didn't land. Elena ducked under it, drove an elbow into the soft cartilage beneath his jaw, and used his own momentum to put him down hard on top of his partner. For about 2 seconds, the market ring went completely silent. I don't think anyone, myself included, had ever seen 2 Ordu enforcers put on the ground by anything smaller than a Kryvex, let alone by a single unarmed human standing over a sealed case of spore samples. Then Brigoth roared and came in himself, and that's when it stopped being a demonstration and started being genuinely dangerous. He was 3 times her mass, 4 arms against her too, and he didn't bother with technique. He just grabbed her with both upper arms and slammed her into the nearest support strut hard enough to buckle the metal. She got up. Bleeding from a cut above her eye, one arm clearly favoring an injury, she got up anyway and put herself back between Brigoth and the case. "Stay down," Brigoth snarled, genuinely furious now, the amusement long gone from his voice. "You've made your point. Stop before I stop being polite about it." "You were never polite," Elena said, and there was something in her voice that made even me, watching from a safe distance behind a supply crate, go cold. "You were just bored." He hit her then, a full swing with all 4 arms, and this time she didn't get up right away. She lay there against the base of the bent strut, breathing hard, blood pooling beneath her, and Brigoth stood over her, chest heaving, looking, for just a moment, almost uncertain about what he'd actually done. That's when her case, still sealed, still perfectly intact where she'd protected it through everything, began to chime. Not an alarm. A soft, rhythmic pulse of light, blue-green, spilling out from the seams of the casing like something inside had woken up and was very calmly sending a message. None of us knew what that light meant. We found out about 90 seconds later when every screen on Kestrel's reach, every terminal, every wall display, every handheld device on the station, flickered simultaneously to a single frequency, and the station's ancient proximity alarms, the ones bolted into the hull since before any of us were born, went off in a pattern none of us had ever heard. Not a warning chime. A resonance alarm, the kind reserved for a very specific, very rare category of contact. Umbreal choir vessel, inbound, unscheduled. I need to explain what the Umbreal choir are, because most people outside the core systems have never heard of them. And that's very much by design. They're not a species you fight. They're not a species you trade with in any conventional sense. They're crystalline, distributed intelligences. Some say a single organism spread across thousands of individual bodies. Others say a civilization that stopped bothering with the concept of individual identity generations ago. They communicate through light and resonant frequency rather than sound. They almost never leave their home cluster, and when they do, It's because something they consider sacred has been threatened. Nobody on Kestrel's Reach had ever seen one in person. We'd only heard the stories, how an Umbreal choir vessel had once dismantled an entire pirate fleet in 11 minutes without firing a single conventional weapon, simply by turning every metal hull in the fleet resonant to its own destruction frequency. How diplomats who'd tried to negotiate territorial claims near a choir cluster had come back changed, quieter, unwilling to discuss what they'd seen. The vessel that arrived outside Kestrel's Reach didn't look like a warship. It looked like a shard of dark glass the size of a small moon, and it didn't dock so much as simply arrive, folding space around itself in a way that made every instrument on the station scream error messages simultaneously. It didn't force the airlock. It didn't need to. The bay doors simply stopped being solid for exactly as long as it took 3 towering, faceted figures to step through, their bodies refracting the harsh station lighting into slow-moving fractals of color, and then became solid again the instant they'd passed. The lead figure, taller than a Kryvex, built from what looked like layered dark quartz lit from within by a slow, pulsing glow, crossed the market ring without a single wasted motion. The crowd, Bregoth included, scattered before it, the way water scatters before a stone. It knelt beside Elena, and it spoke. Not in sound exactly, but in a resonance that somehow arrived in my mind, already translated, already understood, the way you understand a memory rather than hear a sentence. Bloomkeeper. We felt the seal strain. Elena's eyes fluttered open. Blood was still running from the cut above her eye, and her voice, when it came, was ragged but somehow amused. Hey, Illith, you're early. The distress resonance does not wait for a convenient schedule, the choir figure replied, and I swear, even translated through pure light and vibration, I could hear something like fond exasperation in it. Who has done this? Elena tried to sit up, wincing. It's fine. It's handled. It is not handled. Who? Bregoth, to his credit or his terror, didn't try to run. He simply stood there, all 4 arms slack at his sides, staring up at something that made him look, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely small. The choir figure, Illith, turned its refracting gaze toward him, and the light across its surface shifted into something colder, sharper, a pattern I felt more than saw. You struck the Bloomkeeper. I didn't know, Bregoth managed. I didn't know what she was carrying. I didn't know any of this. You did not need to know what she carried to know that she asked you to stop, and you did not stop. Illith's light pulsed once, slow and heavy, like a held breath. That is the only fact that matters here. For those of you who don't know the story of the Bloom, and honestly, until that day, neither did I, I'll tell you what I learned afterward, pieced together from Elena herself, from the choir's own public archive, and from a very long, very quiet conversation I had with Illith some weeks later, once the dust had settled and the station had more or less stopped shaking. 40 years ago, the Umbreal choir's home cluster was dying. Not from war, not from famine, but from a slow crystalline rot, a resonance decay that ate through their structures generation after generation, and which no species in known space had ever successfully treated, because no species in known space had ever bothered to try. The choir were considered too strange, too inaccessible, too unprofitable to be worth the effort. Except one human botanist, Elena's grandmother, Dr. Miriam Voss, had spent 3 decades of her life studying resonant fungal symbiosis on Terran soil, work that every major research institution in known space had dismissed as a curiosity with no practical application. When the choir's distress finally reached the wider trade networks, buried in a low-priority scientific bulletin nobody important read, Miriam Voss was the only person in known space who recognized what she was looking at, and the only person stubborn enough to spend her own retirement funds chartering a ship to go find out if she was right. She was right. The spore cultures she developed, grown from a strain of Terran fungus modified to bond with crystalline resonance structures, didn't just halt the decay. They reversed it slowly over decades, seeding the choir's home cluster with a living lattice that stabilized what should have been a dying civilization. Miriam Voss died 11 years before the incident I'm telling you about now. Elena had spent every year since continuing her grandmother's work, hand-carrying the next generation of cultures out to the fringes of known space, because the seed vaults on frontier stations like Kestrel's Reach were exactly the kind of desperate, overlooked places that most needed what she carried, and exactly the kind of place nobody else would bother visiting. To the Umbreal choir, Elena Voss wasn't a fringe species trader worth 300 credits and a public humiliation. She was the granddaughter of the being who had saved their entire civilization from extinction, and she carried, quite literally, the living proof of that debt strapped to her back. They didn't call her little brother. They didn't need a kinship word at all. They called her Bloomkeeper, and the resonance in that single word, Illith told me later, carried more weight in choir tradition than any oath a human court could ever administer. Illith rose, and the light across its body shifted again, spreading outward until it seemed to fill the entire market ring with a slow, cold pulse that made every screen and terminal on the station flicker in time with it. Bregath Kalu, it said, and the name landed like a verdict already decided. You will be marked. Marked how? Bregath whispered. Your resonance signature, your presence in any system, on any vessel, near any structure attuned to choir frequency, will register. Every choir-adjacent trade network, every choir-aligned port, will know the moment you arrive, and will know why. You will not be harmed. You will simply never again be unknown to us. Wherever you go, we will already know you are there, and we will know what you did here. I watched Bregath's face as that sentence landed, and I understood for the first time that some punishments don't need violence to be devastating. A being who had spent his entire life relying on nobody watching closely enough to catch him had just been told that somewhere, always, something vast and patient would be watching him for the rest of his life. Trask and Vol, still nursing their injuries on the deck, received the same marking. Neither of them said a word. Then Illith turned to the rest of us, the crowd, the watchers, the ones who had laughed or said nothing or simply looked away. How many witnessed this? It said, and I felt the question settle over the whole market ring like a physical weight, though I don't think it was really a question at all. Elena, still sitting against the buckled strut, spoke before anyone else could. Illith, don't. They allowed this to happen in front of them. They didn't know what I was carrying. They didn't know what any of this meant. I didn't either, the first time I saw one of your vessels. I was terrified, same as they are right now. She winced, pressing a hand to her ribs. I'm invoking Bloomkeeper's grace. That's a real thing, right? You told me it was a real thing. A long pause. The light across Illith's surface slowed, dimmed, softened into something that felt, even to a species with no crystalline anatomy at all, unmistakably gentle. It is a real thing, Illith said finally. Grace is granted, Bloomkeeper, but let them understand what they witnessed, so that the next small thing that walks through their gate does not stand alone. It turned back to face the market ring one final time, and its voice, that impossible translated resonance, reached every single one of us at once. You measured her by her size, and you were wrong. You will measure differently from now on, not because we demand it, because you have now seen what it costs to be wrong. Illith carried Elena back toward the shard vessel, with a care that looked strange coming from a body made of stone and light, cradling her the way you'd carry something you were terrified of dropping. Just before the bay doors sealed themselves back into solidity behind them, she looked back at the market ring, at me, at Bregath, at all of us, and said the only thing any of us would remember clearly by the next morning, once the shock had worn off enough to let memory settle. I'm not angry. I just need you to remember this the next time someone small walks through that gate. Then the vessel folded space around itself and was gone, and Kestrel's Reach was left standing in the wreckage of its own certainty. Bregath never worked the trial gate again. Nobody would stand near him on shift, not out of pity, but because being near a choir marked, being turned out to carry its own quiet, contagious risk, ships that wouldn't dock if he was aboard, ports that suddenly developed capacity issues whenever he tried to transfer through. Within a season, he'd taken a maintenance posting on a rock so far out on the fringe, it didn't have a name, just a registry number, and none of us ever heard from him again. The Combine tried briefly to control the story, The same way every station administration tries to control a story that's already too big to control. It didn't work. The choir don't hide their archives the way most powers do. Their public resonance logs are, by their own philosophy, simply true, available to anyone who bothers to look, and within days the footage, if you can call a resonance recording footage, was circulating through every trade network from the fringe to the core. The trial gate was quietly abolished within the month. Nobody wanted to be the administrator who'd let it stand a day longer than necessary. As for Elena, she finished her exchange 3 weeks later than planned, once she'd healed enough to walk the market ring herself. She set up a modest stall, sold exactly what she'd come to sell, and didn't ask for a single credit of compensation for what had happened to her. When I asked her why, she just shrugged and said her grandmother always told her that the whole point of doing something worth doing was that you didn't need anyone to make it right afterward. You just needed to keep doing it. She still comes through Kestrel's Reach twice a year, same as always, same reinforced case on her back. Nobody at the trial gate has ever asked her to open it since. I think about that day more than almost anything else in my life, and I've had a long time now to sit with what it actually taught me. The galaxy runs on the same lazy shortcut everywhere you go. Big frightens small, loud drowns out quiet, and nobody bothers to ask what a soft-looking stranger might be carrying before they decide how much respect that stranger deserves. It's an old habit, older than any single species, and it survives because it's usually, a safe enough bet. But usually isn't always. And every so often, the quiet ones turn out to be carrying something ancient and enormous on their backs, something that has been waiting patiently for exactly the moment someone decides to be cruel to them, so that the debt finally comes due. I learned 3 things standing in that market ring, and I don't think I'll ever unlearn them. 1. Never assume you know what's inside a case somebody is willing to bleed to protect. 2. The smallest being in the room is very often the one who has already survived something the rest of us can't imagine. And 3. The galaxy keeps its ledgers longer than any of us like to think, and somewhere out there, something vast and patient is always keeping count. I wish I could tell you Kestrel's Reach was the only place that changed that day, but the truth is the story spread a lot further than our little wheel of rusted metal, and it changed things I never expected it to touch. Within a week, the resonance recording had made its way into every major trade network from the fringe systems all the way to the core worlds, and with it came a wave of very uncomfortable questions that a lot of very comfortable institutions had spent decades avoiding. If the Umbreal Choir, a civilization every serious diplomat treated as unreachable, unknowable, and frankly not worth the effort of first contact, had quietly maintained a 40-year relationship with a single unassuming human family, what else had the galaxy's major powers simply failed to notice because they hadn't thought it was worth looking? The scientific community, in particular, did not handle the revelation gracefully. 6 research institutes that had rejected Miriam Voss's original resonant fungal symbiosis proposal all those decades ago suddenly discovered a very keen, very public interest in her archived research notes. One of them, a supposedly prestigious Xenobotanical Institute on Threll Prime, actually issued a formal statement acknowledging that their historical review board had, in hindsight, been insufficiently rigorous in evaluating unconventional applicant proposals, which is about as close as an institution like that will ever come to admitting it. Laughed a brilliant woman out of a grant meeting 40 years ago and then spent the following decades pretending it hadn't. Elena, for her part, wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She turned down 3 separate offers to headline symposiums about her grandmother's work, declined an invitation to a Core World gala thrown in her honor by people who, a month earlier, wouldn't have returned her calls and kept doing exactly what she'd always done, flying quiet routes to overlooked stations, carrying cultures to people who actually needed them, refusing every request for an interview except the one she eventually gave me, over a cup of truly terrible station coffee, in the weeks before she moved on to her next stop. They don't actually want to understand what happened, she told me, turning her cup slowly between her hands. They want a story they can put their name next to now that it's safe to. That's fine. I don't need them to understand it. I just need the next station on my route to still have soil worth saving when I get there. I asked her, because I couldn't help myself, whether she'd ever been afraid, standing there bleeding in that ring with 3 choir figures folding space open behind her. She thought about it for a long moment before she answered. I was afraid the whole time, she said. Every step of it. I just decided a long time ago that being afraid and stopping were 2 different things, and I only had to manage one of them. There's one more piece of this story I need to tell you, because it's the part that actually changed how Kestrel's Reach operates, day to day. Long after the excitement died down and the news networks moved on to whatever crisis came next. The Kryvek security detail, the 8-limbed enforcers who'd stood along the walls that day, watching the whole thing unfold without lifting a single limb to intervene, took the incident harder than almost anyone else on the station, harder even than the Combine did. It surprised me at the time. It doesn't anymore. See, the Kryveks have their own old rigid caste instincts, bred into them over centuries of a homeworld hierarchy that rewards strength and punishes hesitation. Standing by while a smaller being took a beating wasn't cruelty to them. It was simply the correct expected response to a dispute between a Combine enforcer and an unsponsored fringe trader. Interfering would have meant stepping outside a role they'd spent their entire lives being trained to respect without question. Watching Elith walk through a bay door that simply stopped existing for exactly as long as it needed to broke something loose in that training, in a way none of us fully understood until the station's next security briefing. 3 days later, when the Kryvek's watch captain, a scarred old veteran named Ostrin, who'd run that detail longer than I'd worked in the seed vault, stood in front of his entire unit and told them, flatly, that the old rule was retired, effective immediately. Any being, regardless of species classification, regardless of sponsorship status, who asked for help at the trial gate would receive it. No questions asked, no exceptions made, and any Kryveks who stood by and watched a repeat of what happened to Elena Voss would be answering to him personally before they ever had to answer to anything with a resonance frequency. I don't think Ostrin did it out of guilt exactly, though I'm sure some of that was in there. I think he did it because, for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had shown him what the actual cost of "not my problem" could look like, up close, in a language even an old Kryvek's veteran couldn't pretend not to understand. Small thing, maybe, in the scale of a galaxy that big, but I've watched new arrivals come through that gate every week since, and I've watched Kryvek's guards step forward now, unprompted, the moment somebody starts raising a voice they shouldn't. That's not nothing. That's a wheel of rusted metal spinning slowly around a dead system nobody important cares about, quietly becoming a slightly kinder place than it used to be. I'll take it. There's a question that came up a lot in the weeks after, whispered in the market ring, argued over in the cafeteria, debated across a dozen trade networks by people who'd never set foot on Kestrel's Reach and never would. I heard it phrased 100 different ways, but it always came down to the same uncomfortable core. How many more of them are there? How many quiet, unimpressive, easily dismissed strangers were walking through gates just like ours, all across known space, carrying debts and alliances and old kindnesses that nobody had bothered to notice because nobody had bothered to ask? How many species had we all collectively spent generations filing under fringe and minor and non-threatening, without once wondering what any of them might have quietly done decades ago for someone who happened to remember? Nobody has a real answer to that question. I don't either, but I'll tell you what I started doing differently, and what I've noticed a lot of people on this station quietly started doing too, without ever really talking about it out loud. We started asking. Not interrogating, just asking. A simple question offered before any judgment got made. What are you carrying, and can I help you carry it? It costs nothing to ask. It would have cost us everything that day if nobody ever had. I mentioned Ostrin, the Kryvek's watch captain, and I want to close his part of this story properly, because I think it says something true about how these things actually change people, slower and quieter than the highlight reel ever shows. About 4 months after the incident, long after the trade networks had moved on to some other scandal, Ostrin came to find me in the seed vault, which he'd never done before in 11 years of us working the same station. He didn't say much. He just handed me a data slate and asked if I'd hold on to it in case anything ever happened to him, because he didn't entirely trust the station archive not to quietly lose it the way inconvenient records on Kestrel's Reach had a habit of getting lost. It was a letter. Not to Elena. He'd never worked up the nerve to send her one directly, he admitted, a little embarrassed, like a being 3 centuries old shouldn't still be capable of feeling embarrassed about anything. It was a letter to himself, addressed to whichever watch captain took over the Krivex detail after he eventually retired or died, whichever came first. It laid out, in careful, formal language, exactly what had happened that day at the trial gate, exactly what his old training had cost, and exactly what he expected of whoever stood in his post next. The last line of it has stuck with me ever since, because I think it's the truest thing anyone said about the whole affair, truer even than anything Illith's translated resonance managed to convey. We did not fail her because we were weak. We failed her because we had decided, long before she ever arrived, that she wasn't worth the risk of being wrong about. Do not make that mistake again. The cost of being wrong about someone small is always larger than you think, and you will not get to choose when the bill arrives. I still have that slate. I keep meaning to give it to whoever takes over the detail when Ostrin finally does retire, though I suspect, knowing him, he'll find some stubborn way to still be standing at that gate long after the rest of us have moved on. Some debts, it turns out, aren't the kind you pay once and forget. They're the kind you carry forward, quietly, one shift at a time, until carrying them stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like exactly the kind of person you'd always meant to be. I think about that letter more than I probably should, usually late in a shift when the vault's quiet and the station's settling into its overnight hum around me. It's easy, from the outside, to imagine a moment like ours as a single dramatic turning point, the vessel, the light, the verdict, and forget that the actual change happened afterward, in 1,000 small, boring decisions nobody filmed and nobody put in a highlight reel. A guard choosing to step forward instead of stepping back. An administrator choosing to tear down a gate instead of quietly rebuilding it under a new name. A woman with a case on her back choosing, over and over, to keep walking into rooms that had already hurt her once because somewhere out past the fringe, somebody still needed what she carried. That's the part of this story I actually want you to remember. If you only remember one part, not the light, not the verdict, the choosing, over and over, long after anyone was watching. A season after the incident, someone, I never found out who, though I have my suspicions, bolted a small metal plate above what used to be the trial gate, where every new trader on Kestrel's Reach still has to pass on their way in. It's still there. I checked before I sat down to tell you this story. It just says, "You don't know what she's carrying. Be kind anyway." I walk past it most days now, and I still think about the light spilling out of that sealed case, calling for help before any of us understood what we were watching. I think about how close we came to never knowing what we'd nearly destroyed. And every time a small, quiet, unimpressive-looking stranger steps through that gate now, I make it a point to ask if they need anything before anyone else gets the chance to laugh. You never really know out here who's somebody's Bloomkeeper. And that's the story. If you made it all the way to the end, first of all, thank you, genuinely. It means a lot that you stuck around for this one. Now I want to hear from you. If you were standing in that market ring, would you have laughed with the crowd, or would you have been the one who stepped forward? Be honest. Drop it in the comments. I want to read your answers, and I promise I read every one of them, even the long ones. If this story gave you even a little bit of that chills down the spine feeling, do 3 things for me right now before you scroll away. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a new story dropping every single week and you do not want to miss the next one. And turn on notifications because these uploads move fast through the algorithm and I don't want you missing out. Got a story idea of your own? A what if you've always wanted to see written? Drop it in the comments below. I pull a lot of my ideas straight from you guys, and your favorite stories on this channel started out as exactly that. One comment from someone just like you. Thanks again for watching. This is Dessa, signing off from Kestrel's Reach. See you in the next one.